I am willing to wager £20,000 that I will make a tour of the world in 80 days or less. You accept?
I accept.
Train leaves for Dover this evening. Good evening, gentlemen.
Hello everyone and welcome to 80 Days, an exploration podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by three history and geography nerds in an internet-powered balloon. This podcast is dedicated to discussing little-known countries, territories, settlements, and cities from around the world. My name is Luke Kelly, I'm broadcasting from Hong Kong, and joining me today are...
Mark Boyle in Surrey in the UK.
And Joe Byrne in Bern, Switzerland.
And in today's episode we'll be talking about the tiny mountain kingdom of Lesotho, home to the Basuto people. This nation is completely surrounded on all sides by South Africa, although it has managed to retain its independence from its much larger neighbour. It's one of only three nations to be entirely surrounded by another country, the others being the Vatican City and our old friend San Marino. It's also by far the largest of these three at around 30,000 square kilometres, making it roughly the size of Belgium or the US state of Hawaii. Lesotho is one of the highest countries in the world, standing at an average of 1,500 metres above sea level, making it the fifth highest nation in the world by average elevation. Lesotho's lowest point is higher than the lowest point of any other country in the world. Its combination of high altitude and a relatively cool climate results in it being free of tropical diseases. Rainfall is highly variable, farming is difficult, and the country has very few natural resources. Sesotho is the national language, but English is the language of business, government, and education. Lesotho also has a population of around 2 million, and its capital and largest city is Maseru. It's also one of the only nations we've ever come across with a hat on its flag.
It's a great flag.
Flag hat.
It is a great flag, yeah.
And a new flag.
Joe, do you have some context about the flag? I believe you were talking about it before we started recording.
Yeah, just that it was brought in only in 2006, replacing the previous flag, which had a shield and some kind of spear on it, because that was very much associated with a political party. And the new flag is horizontal lines of blue, white, and green, which represents the motto of the country, which is Khotso Pula Nala, peace, rain, and prosperity, which are things I think we can all hope for.
A lot of rain, apparently, yeah.
And then the little hat on it. And I think we'll probably talk about the hat later, but it's just kind of the trademark garment of Lesotho. Should we tell listeners that they've probably been pronouncing it Lesotho all their life and been wrong? Or
that's how I was reading it.
Yeah. So if you are wondering what country we're talking about, you think it's called Lesotho, but apparently it isn't.
You rubes, you stupid rubes. We fooled you. We bloody well tricked you, so we have.
Yeah, you probably opened your podcast player and clicked play on this episode and thought, oh, Lesotho. I don't know much about Lesotho. But it's Lesotho, so there's your first fact of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you so angry, it makes you want to spit.
You can switch off now.
I also mentioned during the intro that it's like it's like the fifth highest country by average elevation in the world. Do you guys very quickly want to guess what the other four are that are higher than Lesotho?
I'm going to say Bhutan might be in there.
Switzerland.
Bhutan is number one.
Yeah, boy!
Nepal
is up there as well. That's number two.
Literally up there.
Switzerland's got to be up there, no?
Switzerland is not in the top 15 according to my list.
I suppose it's quite flat where I am, and then mountainy elsewhere. Yeah.
Maybe Iran.
Number 3 and number 4 are Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan.
So not so much mountains as just being high already.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, average height, I think.
Yeah.
Average elevation above sea level. There was one other. I think if you count Antarctica as like a country, I guess, it falls in the 5th position and pushes Lesotho down to number 6, but it's technically not a nation. Mark, do you want to tease the listeners a little bit, titillate them with something that they're going to learn in this episode?
Tickling their sensitive zones with a piece of information that I know and you do not yet know. I'm just going to say that my favorite thing I encountered, and it isn't actually one of the areas I was originally given to research, but I was actually just reading it last night, which is one of the ways it stayed fresh in my memory, but is an unusual use for a tin of condensed milk. That is coming up later on.
Well, I'm intrigued.
Okay, all right. Joe?
Mine's a bit more prosaic. I just love how through my section you're going to see constant underestimation of them by the British and the Dutch. the Dutch settlers just kind of going, these are just natives. We can take them, and then they'd keep getting whooped. Basically, they would hide in mountains. They're really good at hiding in mountains, racing out with their cavalry and guns, killing all the people trying to take their stuff, and going back into the mountains. And it's a good strategy for not being super well colonized. Geography helps.
Definitely, the geography of this place definitely plays a massive role in its history, and we're going to find out more about that throughout the course of this episode. Mine is a very interesting story about how to treat someone who eats a member of your family.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And it's not how you would think. Mark, let's start with early history. How about that? What can you tell us about the early history of Lesotho?
Not a damn thing. If you start with that tone, Luke, keep a civil tongue in your head. Thank you kindly. So, okay, archaeological studies in Lesotho were limited apparently up until about the 60s, 70s, but there has been evidence of artifacts dating from the Middle Stone Age. We're talking about 280,000 years ago, up to about 25,000 years ago. So lots of stone implements. The main sites of interest in Lesotho are kind of natural shelters, so rock shelters, caves, and the reason for that is generally Lesotho was used as a sort of a seasonal hunting ground. It's very high up, as we've said, which means it's also quite cold, wet, exposed, what have you. So it's not necessarily some place to spend all of your time in year round. Generally, it would be hunters and gatherers just kind of storming through and using hunting encampments. We're talking in this context about the San people.
Okay.
One of the ways they actually found some of the main archaeological sites was literally consulting with the last generations of San in the area, saying, okay, where do you guys camp when you do your hunting? Oh, over there. Okay, well, that's where they've done it for thousands of years. So, okay, that's where all the artifacts are.
These are the same kind of people we met in Namibia, right?
Yes, very widespread across the area.
Very first episode, going back to 2 years ago or whatever, yeah.
For better or worse, they're kind of what you think of when you think of early human settlers in Africa. You're thinking of transitory cave paintings, hunting, living nomadically in the bush, all that kind of stuff.
And some people still living that lifestyle in definitely in South Africa and Namibia, but I don't think so much here anymore.
Not so much. Cave paintings are worth going into a little bit because they're particularly important in Lesotho. There's a huge national park spanning the border between Lesotho and South Africa. It's the Maloti Drakensberg Park. It is the largest and most concentrated group of rock paintings in Africa south of the Sahara. Outstanding both in quality and diversity of subject. And apparently they would use fat mixed with some of the red dirt, and they would be painted on with a feather or a thin brush of some kind. And also, apparently in some of them you would see wagons and other artifacts of European involvement. So they were kind of an ongoing record of what was happening in the area.
So oil paintings, basically.
Yeah, essentially oil paintings on stone. And you can still see them there today.
Nice.
So we're talking 80,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, thereabouts. So when we talk about the San people, we're talking about the people who were peopling before any other people peopled. They are people 1.0 OG people, and it all started in this area. After the San, around the 1600s, the San numbers started to decrease, and Bantu-speaking people started to move to the area. I'm not really going to talk about their culture so much. We also talked about them in Namibia, as I recall.
Yeah, but this is a big movement in Africa from sort of the Congo, Niger deltas into all of the south of the continent.
It was just a general demographic kind of change.
Yeah, and Swahili would be the biggest language group of that expansion. Swahili and Zulu and...
I'm going to flash forward towards the 1800s, where the Bantu people themselves started to come under pressure. It's a mix of white encroachments, thumbs down, and the rise of a local African power, the Zulu, that you just mentioned. So I'm talking here about Shaka Zulu, which is both a name that you may have heard of. There's actually a statue in London to Shaka Zulu. So Shaka Zulu was also a very famous leader. He was apparently part of the quote-unquote militaristic Zulu tradition. And bearing in mind that when you're reading this, you're generally reading the accounts of British Empire denizens. So them calling the Zulu militaristic, I mean, in one sense, they probably were pretty militaristic then, but also if the Brits are saying it, probably take it with a pinch of salt at the same time.
But I mean, they gave them a run for their money.
Yeah, true enough. So Shaka Zulu became the dominant leader. He destroyed his brother's army. He was one of the kind of royal family. Just wanted to mention that he was born in 1787 as a result of the ritual of Ukulo Bongo,
Oh, I read about this. Yeah.
light, casual, bilateral crotch touching. And in his case, it went beyond the level of light, and he was born. So after destroying his brother, he then won a Zulu civil war, and as a result, he became obviously like the dominant Zulu leader, and started just sucking in support. And it wasn't all just military stuff. He was also quite a diplomat, and was also very successful at engaging with the complex alliances and systems of patronage that were there in the culture.
But he did bring a lot of new military techniques to bear, right? The stabbing spears and the...
Yeah, he had different weapons, guerrilla tactics. There was also something called the bullhorn formation, which apparently he created.
Yeah, I heard about this.
So it's essentially a three level approach. You have the main force, which is the chest of the bull, which just runs straight into the opposition. Then you have the horns of the bull, which flank the opposition, and then you have the loins of the bull, which are your reserve force, and you make them stand with their backs turned to the battle so that they won't become, nervous or spooked by what they see.
Or overexcited.
Oh, wow.
As they are the loins, after all. Limited utility, I would say. But they were essentially reserve, and they would run in when things got too much.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to mention, I found this Zulu praise song. He is Shaka the Unshakable, thunderer while sitting, son of Menzi. He is the bird that preys on other birds, the battle axe that excels over other battle axes in sharpness. He is the long-strided pursuer, son of Nadaba, who pursued the sun and the moon. He is the great hubbub, like the rocks of Nakandla, where elephants take shelter when the heavens frown, which is pretty good. That's pretty amazing.
I did a little bit of background reading about this guy, and he I mean, as far as I can see, I don't know if you came across this, Mark, there are no official portraits of it or anything of him. No. as far as I could find, but the kind of artist impressions that they have of him, he looks, I mean, there's not really any other way to say it. He looks like a total badass. He looks really
fierce,
savage.
Yeah.
He's what you would expect a Zulu warlord to look like.
But he basically was the Zulu warlord. They were an insignificant grouping before him. And then they took over all of that southeast corner of what's now South Africa in his lifetime.
So at the time that he was king, the chaos he created in his region by creating this new grouping was so mental, they gave it a name. It was known as the Mefekana, and it was a time of maximum insanity. Shaka Zulu actually died quite young. He would only last a few more years after kind of forming this grouping, and would actually be killed by his siblings in the end. But as we all know, chaos is a ladder, and this chaos that he created in the region kind of set the stage for the next significant leader that we're going to see here.
And I don't know if you looked into it, Mark, but Mefekane, I think was what you called it, translates roughly into the crushing.
Oh my God!
Yep.
Which kind of gives you an idea of how brutal and savage this time was.
Either crushing, scattering,
yes,
or the time of troubles is a modern translation. But you basically had everyone fleeing Zulus completely reshuffled where everyone in that part of Africa lived. So a tribe would flee the Zulus and then kill the people living in the place they wanted to flee to, and then they'd flee somewhere else. And it was just
lot of killing.
And our friends, the Basuto, got caught up in all of that.
Yep.
So in 1786, around the same time that Shaka was born, the son of a minor chief, Kowena clan, I believe the Crocodile clan, was born and named Lepokwo. This kid, his father was a kind of a regional chief. He had very little kind of power of his own. He kind of reported to a big chief, who probably reported to an even bigger chief. But as Lepokwo was growing up, his people experienced some severe droughts, and his community remained very poor, generally very destitute. But Lepokwo had aspirations of becoming a great leader, and he consulted this kind of seer, kind of wise man called Mohlomi, and asked him for potions or tinctures or herbs to make him a great leader, make him wise and powerful, give him the qualities that would allow him to become a great leader. And Mohlomi told him that those qualities were not dependent on any potions or anything that you could get from the outside world, but were reliant on clarity of mind, goodness of heart, and service to one's fellow men.
But I want to buy it. I just want to buy it.
Yeah.
Why can't I buy leadership?
I just want the shortcut. But Mohlomi urged this kid to stay close to his grandfather as well, to cherish his friendship with his grandfather, who was apparently also a very wise man, and keep him safe from harm. And when the time came, this kid should take care of his grandfather's corpse and make sure that it was well respected.
It's weird advice,
and
but
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, weird advice, but that's apparently what again, a lot of this is kind of like, shrouded in legend.
well, they didn't write,
this
so
is-
it's oral history.
Yeah.
He told people this.
Yeah.
What he told people was.
So, in his quest to become a great leader, Lepokwo led a lot of cattle raids against neighboring tribes. And after one particularly successful cattle raid, he described himself as a razor which has shaved all of his enemies' beards. And the sound in the Basotho culture that a razor makes is shwe shwe. So this young man, Lepokwo, took the name Mushweshwe, which means the man who...
The dude who razors people. Yeah, shaver.
Yeah, the razor man. Or
The barber?
The shaver of enemies.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
The barber or...
Death Barber.
Yeah. So that's where we get one of the most influential people in Lesotho's history, which is this guy, Mushweshwe. And Mushweshwe did end up rising in stature, and he kind of arranged a number of prominent marriages between different members of different clans, and kind of rose up the ranks and was able to solidify his rule over these people. He also gained a reputation for being a very forgiving leader, and generally was the kind of person who, when he beat another chief or an enemy, he would help them up and take them under his wing, rather than killing them outright. And his rise in the Basotho culture was kind of mirrored with the rise of Shaka and the sort of Zulu wars that we were talking about earlier. So it's interesting, you can kind of contrast these two guys, because Shaka, as you mentioned, Mark, earlier, is very, I would say, a very violent.
Stop.
Yeah, very warlike kind of guy, whereas Mushweshwe, who is kind of, again, coming to prominence during this time, is very much the opposite. He's all about peace and about reconciliation and bringing people together, whereas Shaka was, the crushing.
Maybe there's something nice in that story of where his name comes from. So Shaka is kind of making his fame by being a killer, and Mushweshwe is making his name literally by being a clever thief. A clever redistributor of resources.
Yeah, and that's one thing about him that will become more obvious as we go on. He's a very shrewd, clever kind of almost trickster-like kind of guy. He realizes that he doesn't have a huge amount of military power,
right,
or a huge amount of leverage in terms of bargaining or anything, but he does have a very sharp mind, as it seems. So
yeah, and he consolidates lots of tribes under his Sotho rule.
Yeah. So in order to escape the Zulu threat, Mushweshwe decides that he needs to bring his people from his ancestral home into this place called Taba Bosiu, which translates to, and this is really cool, is the Mountain of the Night, which is just a high mountain fortress where he believes he can bring his people together and protect them from the threats that are rising in the area.
And the legend was that the mountain would get bigger every night to make it even more defensible, which is cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. So on his journey, Mushweshwe and his people had to pass through an area which was apparently occupied by people who had been driven by starvation and famine into cannibalism.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Have we done an episode without cannibalism ever?
I don't think we have. A cannibal seems to crop up a lot.
People like people.
Tasmania, Liberia.
Yeah. Uruguay.
Oh god.
Well, that was kind of defensive cannibalism. Anyway.
So having acquired a taste for human flesh, the cannibals in this area were apparently formed themselves into hunting parties and would set off every day from where they were based to catch and eat humans.
Oh my god.
Basically, yeah. So when Moshoeshoe and the leaders of his group passed through this area, they, like the kind of younger, healthier people at the front of the column, made it through fine. But as hunters tend to do, these cannibals decided to pick on the weak, the frail, the elderly, mothers with babies who were kind of, at the back of Moshoeshoe's group of people. And one of the people that was carried off by these cannibals was, can you guess?
Oh no.
Moshoeshoe?
Moshoeshoe's grandfather.
Oh no! No!
That was somewhat predictable narratively.
Oh god, you set it up as well.
Moshoeshoe's proud, wise old grandfather is carried off by cannibals. And upon hearing about this attack, Moshoeshoe dispatched a group of his best warriors to rescue the victims. It wasn't just his grandfather, there was a few other people. But apparently, by the time that the warriors were able to locate the people that had been abducted, all they discovered were a few blood-stained rocks, some discarded garments, and a single collarbone.
Oh god.
Yeah. So how does Moshoeshoe respond to this? Well, there's a lot of different opinions and kind of theories on exactly how this whole situation played out. But as we've already learned, Moshoeshoe is a leader who is dedicated to conciliation and peace. And apparently, Moshoeshoe decides that he's going to rehumanize these cannibals and integrate them into his society.
Wow.
He captures them, takes them to the Mountain of the Night, prepares a feast for them.
What kind
Wait. What kind of
after
feast?
the
What kind of
feast-
feast? What kind of feast?
It's a totally normal feast, apparently. Again, this is all oral history, but apparently
See,
it's
cow
totally-
tastes
totally-
good, right?
Yeah. And at the end of the feast, Moshoeshoe is said to have offered each one of the cannibals a cow and a plot of land on which to build a house, saying, "You are the graves of my ancestors, and you belong among us."
Ooh,
Which is just
That's weird.
that's a
Just
weird logic.
insane, because Mahlomi, as we heard earlier, had encouraged Moshoeshoe to look after his grandfather's corpse. And this is, I guess, in a sick kind of twisted way, is where his
Yeah.
grandfather's
Corpse
corpse
is in
now
these
resides, in these
cannibals.
people. Yeah. So
I mean,
yeah.
another way to go, maybe the Shaka Zulu way to go, would have been to kill all of them and bury them in a place that you know and put a nice
Yep.
little statue of your grandfather
Yeah.
on top of it.
Maybe.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure this is an episode of The Walking Dead I've seen. No, we need to work with the cannibals. Yeah, no, I've
Yeah.
definitely.
Rehumanize them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always ends well.
So Moshoeshoe again didn't want war. He over the years welcomed refugees from the Zulu conflict and established his base at the Mountain of the Night, Taba Bosyu. So, and here at his fortress, it made it a very difficult place for anybody to assault or anybody to take over, which is precisely why he had chosen this place to settle his people.
Yep.
I believe at one point the Zulu did try to attack Moshoeshoe and his people directly, but he kind of bargained with them and would give gifts and would negotiate with them, but never kind of came out of this mountain in which he had enclosed himself and his people.
The story I heard was that they basically gave up the siege because they ran out of supplies, and he sent them supplies as they retreated.
Okay, right.
So like, here, have some food.
Right.
Sorry about the trouble.
Right.
Which is a very confusing gesture.
By the end of the 19th century, then, Moshoeshoe's nation had become known as the nation of the Basutu, or Basutoland. And that's kind of where the beginning of Lesotho comes from. And again, Moshoeshoe was a forward-thinking kind of guy. And in around 1833, he heard that there were missionaries from Europe that were making their way around Southern Africa. And he sent out, sent out messages to them
Invitations.
to invite them invitations to come to Basutoland and to meet with him. And 3 missionaries from the Paris Evangelical Society arrived in 1833, and they were the first to write down the Sesotho language and to teach the Basutu people how to write their own language. And after he had befriended these missionaries, he then kind of recruited them to advise him on foreign relations and diplomatic negotiations.
With the white folk who were starting to turn up.
White folk who were starting to turn up and who were starting to become more and more of an issue in this part of the world, particularly for Moshoeshoe and his people. So we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and see exactly how white people are going to mess up this whole situation that Mashweshwe has going on.
Never.
Yeah, we'll be back after this. All right, so we had Mashweshwe has set up his mountain fortress, the Mountain of the Night, in what is modern day Lesotho. But there are some encroaching forces that are, even more formidable than the Zulu that we talked about previously. You want to tell us a bit about that, Joe?
From the 1820s on, there was a group called the Korana moved into the area, and they were mixed-race Dutch speakers with guns and horses. And they forced the Basotho to retreat into their mountain fortress again. And Mashweshwe decided that this was the time to arm his people with Western guns and to acquire horses. So really, that was the first sign that the Europeans were going to be trouble. We've kind of alluded to South Africa a few times. Obviously, modern-day Lesotho is surrounded by modern-day South Africa. But where South Africa as a project started was the 1652 founding of the Cape Colony, a stopover point on the Cape of Good Hope for ships on their way to India. And that was a Dutch settlement. There were Dutch-speaking settlers there. They would have traded with the local Khoi people and San people. They would have they had slaves from Madagascar and from Malaysia and from various other parts of the world. And so you ended up with a very...
and this kind of ties in very much with our episode on St. Helena as well.
Yeah. There were people end up over there too. We've hinted to its history in Namibia and St. Helena, as you say. And I think even the Seychelles had come up a little bit. But obviously we've never gone in too deep because this isn't about the Cape Colony today. Mm-hmm. But what's important to this story is that it came in and out of British control over the 17 and 1800s, particularly when the French Revolutionary Wars were happening and the Netherlands were conquered by Napoleon. It came into British control. I think it went back to Dutch control for a while, but by the time we're talking about it, was a British-controlled colony at the Cape.
Okay.
And tensions started to arise between the Dutch-speaking colonists and their new British masters who wanted to change their laws, their language, their way of life, and so on. This led to one of the great movements of people in Africa in the 1900s, namely the what was called the Great Trek, where Dutch-speaking settlers, voortrekkers, moved into the interior of Africa from the coast.
So they were like, we're fed up of you British overlords, and we're just moving inland to do our own thing, basically.
Yeah, stop trying to take over our way of life. We're going to go and take over some other people's way of life.
Stop harshing my buzz, man. Yeah.
And they were very committed. Like they were Calvinists usually. They were Dutch speaking. They were usually farmers, and that's where the name Boer comes from, which is the Dutch for farmer, or Afrikaans for farmer, I suppose. The two languages are differentiating during this period. So these people end up on the western borders of what is now Basutoland in the late 1830s. And they were initially welcome because it was kind of a buffer zone between the Basotho and these Korana people who had been causing them trouble. So initially, Mashweshwe was happy enough with these people passing through the land between the Orange River and the Vaal River. But they started settling above the Caledon River, which was a fertile section of land within his territory. And Mashweshwe said on this topic, "The ground in which they were belonged to me, but I had no objection to their flocks grazing there until such a time as they were able to proceed further, on condition, however, that they remained in peace with my people and recognised my authority." But, well, it didn't really go that way.
No, I mean, Mashweshwe, like we heard earlier, was very conciliatory and was sort of like, okay, I'll allow you guys to kind of hang out here for a bit, with my blessing, But
Yep.
yeah, they stayed there for long enough where they saw it as their own land.
As their own.
And, they had been granted
They
this
saw
land
it as given rather than lent.
permanently.
And more and more people moved into the area. There was a treaty in 1845 that sort of formalised white settlement in the area, but it didn't really have fixed borders. Yeah. So you got continued clashes.
Right.
The British claimed sovereignty of the area because they claimed the Dutch-speaking settlers were still their subjects. So anywhere they went was kind of British in a way. And so they claimed that this territory as what was called the Orange River Sovereignty.
Even though these were ostensibly Dutch settlers, they were like, you came from the Cape Colony, therefore
So you're ours.
you represent the British Empire, and therefore this is our settlement.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And so they drew this line called the Warden Line, named after the governor of the area, between the Basutoland and the Orange River. Anyway, of course, the line that the British drew left the most fertile Caledon River land on the British side, and the Basuto got none of it. They continued to graze their herds there because it was theirs, and so there was resistance.
Okay.
Maseru defeated the British cavalry at Fearfoot in 1851, which really embarrassed the British. He looked for alliances with Andries Pretorius, who was the president of the Transvaal Republic, which was a Boer republic further north. The city of Pretoria is named after him. Mm-hmm. And they were kind of going to oppose British sovereignty together. The British suffered a few more defeats from the Basuto cavalry, so they didn't bargain with the strength of the Basuto cavalry and the strength of their strongholds in the mountains. And eventually the colonial secretary, Earl Grey, in London, of tea fame, he got fed up with all of these constant setbacks, and they decided to just give up on claiming this territory.
Deadly.
In 1854, the Sand River Convention gave sovereignty of this area to the Boers who lived there, and it became the Orange Free State, which was a Boer republic.
Okay. The Dutch love their orange. We do know that.
They do, yeah. It was the Orange River, and presumably it's named after the House of Orange, Nassau, in the Netherlands. So the British left, but that actually possibly made things worse. So over the next 10 years, there were three distinct wars between the Orange Free State and Basutoland, which is a lot. It's a high war density.
Yeah. 10 years and 3 wars is, that's not great.
I'll zoom through them because they were all basically about the same thing, which is who owned what land and so on.
Right.
So 1858, you had Senegal's War, where President Boshoff and Maseru couldn't agree on how to stop cattle rustling and agree on who owned what.
Okay.
And Maseru was kind of up for a fight because he felt he'd been losing out. He kept sending out hunting parties into Boer farms just for the fun of it, seizing land that had English titles, claiming that the English didn't rule here anymore. So your title was invalid. War was declared in March by the Boers, but they suffered heavy losses, and they couldn't deal with the high mountain strongholds that the Basuto could retreat to. And they were just fighting with a kind of a militia commandos drawn up from the farmers. They didn't have a standing army. Mm-hmm. They did destroy many of the mission stations that you mentioned, these French missionary stations, blaming them for educating the Basuto and giving them a sense of pride, which was terrible. Africans with a sense of pride and education, very inconvenient to your colonial aspirations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in June that year, there was an armistice. But Maseru was cautious. He was conciliatory. He didn't want to rub the defeated Boer's nose in it. So he didn't push it too far in terms of crushing his enemy. He just accepted the victory of keeping what he had.
That's what he does. Mm-hmm. That's the Maseru way.
1865, there was a second war called the Sakiti War, where the Orange Free State seized loads of cattle and destroyed lots of crops. So they had a lot more of the upper hand in this second war. There was a story I read in the New York Times, a letter from Southern Africa of the time describing a massacre of a group called the Bastards, who were led by Captain Carolus Batje.
Okay.
So these are like the Orlam who we met in Namibia. They were sort of...
Was that self-described as the Bastards?
Yeah, so they were the...
Or is that what, like, the Basuto?
No, they were self-described.
Wow, okay.
So they were the offspring of Dutch settlers and African women.
Okay, interesting.
Who would become this distinct ethnic group. They would, in later South Africa, they would become known as coloureds in the apartheid system.
Right.
So they were, Yeah, they were Dutch speaking. They had guns and horses, but they weren't white in
They were mixed race.
terminology of the kind of racist administrators. So they were known as bastards.
Right.
67 of the men in this group were slaughtered. Only a few escaped who weren't in the camp at the time, and all of the women and children were mostly left with no crops, no herds, and so on. So that doesn't reflect particularly well in the Basotho. It's important to not seem like we're taking sides here.
Sure.
There was atrocities on both sides.
As there are in every conflict, I suppose.
Yes. There's never good guys and bad guys. And the Free Staters failed to storm Thaba Basu despite 2 attempts.
Good.
While they were really at the upper hand, they just couldn't breach this stronghold. But Moshoeshoe was running out of food and running out of supplies, so eventually a peace treaty was signed where he ceded the western lowlands, this arable land that he'd been fighting over, and 3,000 cattle. And this is the point when Moshoeshoe realises that he really needs to consolidate his position and protect what he has.
Right.
So he wrote to Sir Philip Woodhouse, the governor of the Cape Colony, seeking Queen Victoria's protection.
Okay.
Colony.
Hello.
I'm giving myself and my country up to Her Majesty's government under certain conditions that we may agree on between Your Excellency and me.
Yeah, so I have a quote here actually, which is very pertinent to this very topic, from a book called Power in Colonial Africa by Elizabeth Eldridge. It says, when Moshoeshoe first requested British protection against the Boers, he was trying to choose the lesser of 2 evils: indirect British colonial rule in preference to total dispossession by the Boers of the Orange Free State. From that time forward, the Basotho were constrained in their ability to resist colonial oppression by the British because they feared a worse fate at the hands of the Boers.
The British would be more hands-off about it, at least.
Yeah, I figured that the British would be easier to deal with, and we're not literally outside his gates, I suppose. So
Yes.
that's probably why he went in that direction.
But 2 years later, in 67, he still hadn't received a fulfillment of that request, and there was a third war. This one started because 2 whites were murdered in Ladybrand, which was on the Orange Free State side of the Warden line.
Okay.
But when President Brand demanded Moshoeshoe turn over the murderers, he claimed that he'd never agreed to the Warden line.
Okay.
And so the murder had happened in his territory and not in the Free State.
Right.
So it was a bit of a legal stalemate, as it were. He's like, well, it might have happened, but it wasn't, but that's my land. Because it's not, it's our land. It's my land, it's our land.
Right.
The war that follows was pretty brutal. The Boers overran almost all of the Basutoland land, except Thaba Basu again, this stronghold. And Moshoeshoe again reached out to the British, looking for assistance to avoid complete destruction. In 1868, a letter finally arrived from the Secretary of State for the Colonies replying to his request, and Basotho was annexed, with Basotho people becoming British subjects and Basutoland a protectorate. And the Orange Free State was obliged to hold hostilities so as not to aggravate the British. This kind of saved them because the Orange Free State was very much in a precarious position, being somewhat independent, but like, as people will be aware, there were various wars between the Boer republics and the British colonies later that would have resulted in everyone getting subsumed into British rule. So they were right to be concerned about upsetting the British, and it bought them maybe a few more decades of independence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in 1869, the boundaries of present-day Lesotho were drawn up in the Convention of Aliwal North. The Orange Free State kept the captured land, the fertile land of the Caledon River, and there were no further wars with the Boers.
Which I'm sure Moshoeshoe was really happy about.
Well, he saw what way the wind was blowing, and he had to live with it.
So again, as we mentioned earlier, he was a crafty, cunning kind of guy. I mean, he's well into his old age at this point, but I have another quote here from that book from Elizabeth Eldridge. Mm-hmm. She says, Moshoeshoe engaged in strategic dissembling. Doubtless he was a very capable chameleon, always presenting himself in the colour most likely to appeal to the eye of the man with whom he was treating. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, his leanings were always towards peace, and he clearly saw that it was only through peace that his people could thrive. So she kind of goes on a little bit in that book about how he would purposefully misunderstand or pretend to misunderstand orders from the British colonial administrators.
Yes.
And would kind of push things to the limit where
But I didn't understand you because I'm just a savage chieftain.
Bushman.
I didn't know that you wanted.
So
you using their prejudices against them.
yeah, and he would kind of push that to the limit where he would misunderstand or kind of go against their orders to a certain degree without ever kind of going over
Never
the
going
line
too
in terms of them wanting to depose him or anything. He also taught his kids that as well. He taught his kids to kind of play off, as you said, the prejudices of the colonial overlords and really kind of play up that I don't understand what you want or what you mean, kind of thing.
The most famous photograph of him is a good example of that, where he's photographed with a top hat and a cane in a very British style. That's the photo you'll see on Wikipedia or if you Google him. But I found a description of him in a book from the early 1900s from a guy who had met him, and he's described very differently as like naked from the waist up and covered in a mantle of panther skins and with a string of glass beads around his neck and a bracelet of ivory, which is a very African chief look. So he could kind of morph between the two worlds of dealing with the West and dealing with his own people.
Yeah, and that image of him, I think, in the top hat and the cane and kind of the sort of dinner jacket kind of get up is I think the most famous photo of him.
It's possibly the only photo of him.
Yeah, I think we'll put that in the show notes, but I defy any of our listeners to tell me that he doesn't look exactly like Morgan Freeman in that photo. It's uncanny. If you zoom in on his face, it just looks like Morgan Freeman in a top hat. It's great. Definitely check that out in the show notes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he does, right?
He really does look like Morgan Freeman.
Yeah.
Okay. That's,
yeah.
I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah.
So in 1870, Maseru died. As you say, he was an old man at this point, and he's buried at the summit of Tapabasu,
the Mountain of the Night,
the mountain fortress that had kept him safe for these many years.
Okay, so the Basuto have lost their iconic leader, the man who forged the nation together, and in the latter years of his life, he kind of handed over the keys to the kingdom to the British, or was forced to do so, I suppose. So, how did the Basuto people fare under British rule, Joe?
They were never an easy people to keep under your rule, I suppose. They're difficult to please.
Much like Maseru himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of juggling around about who was actually directly responsible for Basutoland. Initially, the colony of Natal was in charge, and then it got annexed to the Cape Colony quite soon afterwards. And Cape rule was very unpopular. And I suppose it's for all the reasons that there were prejudices within the polity of the Cape Colony that would eventually produce apartheid as the system of government. And the seeds of those ideas were probably part of why it wasn't a successful relationship, because they weren't seen as a legitimate, equal, sovereign state within the British sphere of influence. There was always a racial element to, they were natives rather than settlers. An important example of the unpopularity was the 1879 uprising of Chief Morosi. He was a Baputi chief from South Basutoland and a veteran of the Free State Wars.
Okay.
And he rose in open revolt against the British resident magistrate John Austin, who had arrested his son. So his son Dada had refused to pay his hut tax, which I suppose is like a property tax of some sort, and also had been doing some cattle rustling in the traditions of his people. Yes, a mob of Baputi people turned up and released him from prison. Some troops from the Cape Colony tried to get him back, but basically Morosi took all of his people to a place now called Morosi's Mountain. And 300 of them locked themselves up there in the Drakensberg Range in this fortress he'd been building for the last 10 years. And it sounds completely impregnable. Like 3 sides of the mountain were completely vertical, and the fourth side had a 30-degree slope, which was reinforced with strong walls 8 to 12 feet high, impervious to artillery, and with loopholes for guns. So like these guys had really settled in for the long haul. Lots of food,
really thought
lots
this
of
thing
water.
out. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And this sounds like the kind of thing that Maseru probably would have been able to like negotiate his way out of had he still been alive at this time.
Maybe, yeah. but Morosi was a different kind of guy.
Yeah, and we should probably mention that Moshoeshoe's son has taken over the regency at this time and is essentially filling his father's shoes at this time. He's just Moshoeshoe II. We'll probably hear a bit about him later.
He sent 1,500 troops to help in this siege. So 800 Cape soldiers and 1,500 Basuto troops besieged Morosi. So he was, the formal leaders of Basutoland were on side with the British in this case.
Compliant, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Complying, because they'd been promised that they were different. So in the Cape Colony, this Peace Preservation Act had been brought in to disarm all of the natives. Right. And they'd been promised that wouldn't apply to them. Okay. So they were happy to keep working with the Cape. Mm-hmm. But so they held out for 8 months. During the siege, the Victoria Cross was received by 3 different British, Cape mounted rifles and various other Cape military, including one guy who insisted on bringing water to wounded people until his water bottle and his arm were shattered by bullets, and he could no longer do so.
Oh my God!
Right.
That's Trooper Peter Brown. And the final assault took place when they brought in these mortars and started just shelling everything.
Really the only way to assault a mountain, I guess.
And a guy called Bourne had found a fissure up the side of the mountain, which they used to basically rock climb their way into the stronghold while distracting the Baputi troops with mortar fire. And there's an account here from the Queenstown representative describing the pivotal moment in this battle.
Okay.
So if you'll indulge me. The ladder was shifted and placed in another position a little further away. Lieutenant Springer then mounted, and as he ascended, a Baputi above pointed a gun at him. Springer engaged him in conversation in Dutch, and they had a friendly dispute about who should have the first shot. Okay. After gaining the top of the ladder, 15 feet of sloping rock had to be ascended, and directly as Springer showed above the ladder, the Baputi fired, the bullet taking off the undressed cap on Springer's head. Springer then coolly held his rifle in one hand and shot his antagonist, who tumbled down amongst the attacking party. The gallant fellow then sprang on top and was quickly followed by Lieutenants C. Goldsworthy and Winslow, who assisted the others up. So I think that's a lovely, jaunty tale of people killing each other.
Very, very colonial, colonial British kind of style.
Yes, our plucky troops.
Kind of coolly held his rifle in one hand and shot his antagonist.
Yes.
Sure. All right.
Wow. So, they slaughtered everyone. Morosi was found in a cave. He was shot and killed. Most of his sons and wives were killed. 200 of his men. His son Doda led 120 men to escape by throwing themselves into the Orange River, which is one way out.
Throwing themselves, as in like throwing themselves to their death, or just jumping from the mountain into the river?
To escape.
Okay. Yep. All right.
I don't know what they did later, but they didn't die.
Right.
And Morosi's head was cut off and boiled to be shown as a symbol to the... Yeah.
Nice.
And to this day, the Baputi people are now quite scattered in Basutoland.
Right.
But there was all this strife about what would happen to his land after this defeat. Cape Colony obviously wanted to set aside some of it for white settlement because that was their thing. And then they tried to extend the act that took the guns away from black people to Basutoland, which was unpopular for some reason.
I can't imagine why.
And this led to the 1880 Gun War, which led to basically intense British casualties, trying to quell it, guerrilla warfare from the mountain terrain, where the Basuto would ambush British and Cape forces on their home turf. One particularly egregious event for the British was losing an entire regiment, I think 39 men of mounted yeomanry at Calbani. And basically the colonial authorities in the Cape Colony were very discouraged. There was the expense of this war and one against Ngosa in the other parts of Africa that they were trying to control, basically bankrupted them. And in 1884, the British took direct control of Basutoland.
Okay, they were like, we're fed up of all
this. So they took it away from the Cape Colony, just made it a direct protectorate.
Right.
And this went a lot better.
Shall we take a quick break there, and then we'll come back with the 20th century, I suppose?
Perfect. Hi folks, it's time to remind you again that our supporters and Patreon help keep this internet-powered balloon of a podcast in the air. The number of people downloading our show has blown up over the last season, which is great news, but it also means the cost of hosting the show has increased to match. So we'd really like to thank those listeners who've been able to help us out by signing up at patreon.com/80dayspodcast. Their support has been vital to keeping this show going. If you sign up, you'll get rewards such as access to our research notes, a shout out at the end of episodes, a chance to vote on season finales, and more. Thanks too to the dozens of people who filled out our Christmas questionnaire. It was great to hear what you love about the show and where we can improve. Now, back to Lesotho.
So we have the British Crown colony is established in around 1884 in Basutoland. And do you want to tell us what happened following that, Joe?
It's a short enough road from this Crown colony to independence, so let's try get through it as quickly as possible. The way the Crown colony was set up was kind of a mixture of colonial government and traditional tribal chiefs. They kind of mashed the two systems together. And you had an executive council where the members were the resident commissioner who presided over it, 3 ex officio members and 4 council members from the Basotho National Council, which was kind of the parliament, if you will. And one of them would always be the paramount chief. So he was the heir of Mashweshwe was always on this governing council. And yeah, the National Council was 22 chiefs and 40 elected members, elected by district councils, and then 14 people nominated by the British colonial administrator. So it's kind of this weird mixture of democracy, tribal tradition, and colonialism, all mixed up together.
It's a great big compromise that I'm sure everybody's going to be kept very happy by.
As such things go, it sounds fine, you know?
Sure.
Blessedly, they stayed neutral in the Boer Wars. We don't need to talk about them.
Yay.
Awful,
they were
really
terrible.
scary and bad. Shoot, kill, shoot, kill.
Lots of, horrible things. When the British and the Dutch-speaking Boers battered the hell out of each other for a few different wars in a row. The population in Lesotho grew from 125,000 in 1875, which was just before the Crown Colony era, to 310,000 in 1901, and nearly 350,000 only 3 years later. So things were on to grow.
That's pretty rapid. Yeah.
And yeah, there was kind of a gradual drift towards a more urban society. So like the British set up 8 or 9 towns as seats of local government. Towns hadn't really been such a thing beforehand. Everywhere else it was kind of traditional chief headman sort of governance carried on. Chiefs would consult their people. The village elders would have a lechotla to settle minor disputes. But eventually, as the population grew, this became less and less practical. The idea was maybe to have a national equivalent of a chief's court. When Lesotho became too large, that's kind of how we ended up with the National Council, a kind of mixture of chiefs and democratic people that I just mentioned. And this was implemented by Paramount Chief Lerotli. In the early 20th century, you start to get sort of political parties forming, such as the Progressive Association, which was formed by sort of the intelligentsia of the country. And they wanted representative government and a parliamentary system and democracy and so on.
The swine.
Yep. And then the more radical Commoners League was founded a few years later, which is a great name.
Wow.
Commoners League. The Shit-Eaters Cabal.
And they were of the opposite opinion. They wanted more chiefs, more older order, and responsible chieftainship. So you got these kind of varying opinions on which direction governance should go in.
Backwards or forwards, essentially.
Yeah, not enough Indians party. That's a good joke there. Pretty solid joke. Pretty happy with that?
Sure.
Yeah.
In the 1910s, South Africa, the Union of South Africa, is being formed all around them.
Oh,
so
no!
Various states.
We're surrounded.
No!
The Orange Free State and the Cape Colony and what is now KwaZulu-Natal and what was the other one called? Transvaal.
Such a good
are
name.
all sort of coalescing into this British administered union, And there was talks of Lesotho also joining in, and Swaziland, or what's it called now?
Oh, yeah.
Eswatini.
Eswatini? Yeah.
Anyway,
If you like.
they were all considered as potential members, but as the kind of the apartheid type policies of the National Party became more and more apparent, the idea of an all-black state joining South Africa seemed increasingly ridiculous.
Hey, let's pause everything. Fun idea. And just talk about apartheid for the next 2 hours. Nope, terrible idea. Anyway.
No.
Sorry.
No. This is why we're never doing South Africa. But it was an interesting point I read somewhere about how the line between Lesotho, or Basutoland as it was called now, and South Africa was kind of arbitrary. And so Sesotho speakers were on both sides and continue to be. It's one of the biggest, I think it's one of the 11 official languages of South Africa now.
Huh.
So it's still quite widely spoken in its neighbouring country by migrant workers and by permanent settlers. And there were quite different outcomes for people on either side of the border. Sesotho speakers in Basutoland had greater healthcare and educational opportunities. They were independent, obviously, the political expression.
Good.
And they avoided Afrikaner apartheid rule.
Yes.
But the land they lost was better and could have generated more income and wealth, and that income and wealth meant that Sesotho speakers in South Africa maybe had more profitable land to live on. So,
Right.
you win some, you lose some.
So, World War One happened. Little note there.
I mean, that happened. That's a thing that happened.
But also just mentioning about the divide between Basutoland and South Africa, there wasn't really much of a divide as far as the British Empire was concerned with regards taking in people to fight in the war. So they created this South African native labour contingent, which I kind of think we might have met. We've definitely talked about this in terms of, I think, the Gambia in the past, in terms of recruiting locals, more so in World War II. I'll get to that in a second.
Yay.
But basically, they didn't really trust them to do any fighting. They didn't want to give them any guns, but they were very happy to have them do lots of the really difficult, hard work that comes with the war. So, building bridges, digging ditches, etc., etc. So they were sent to France to provide labour support. And the Basutoland soldiers were also affected by the guidance that the South African government had sent through to the British Empire on how they should be treated while in France. And it's super grim.
Really well, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like equals.
I mean...
Just like any other soldier? No?
Judge for yourself. So their accommodation, for example, it should be surrounded by an unclimbable fence or wall in which all openings are guarded.
Oh my God. They'd be used to that, considering they're surrounded by another country at home, right? That's sort of, that's home comforts, right? That's what they were going for.
Bit more permeable.
Yeah.
The fences were to be 6 feet high, with barbed wire running along the top to prevent natives, which is the term I have here, from climbing over. Africans were not permitted outside the camps unless accompanied by an officer or a European NCO, non-commissioned officer. They were prohibited from entering or being served with wine, beer, or spirits in any establishment or place where liquor is sold, and prohibited also from entering shops or business premises unless under European escort. Natives are not allowed to enter or be entertained in the houses of Europeans. It was further stipulated that every effort should be made to prevent all familiarity between Europeans and natives. Finally, just a note, natives were not to be trusted with white women. Any native found wandering around without a pass and not under the escort of a white NCO should be returned to his unit under guard or to the military police. So they were basically treated like criminals throughout in the most discriminatory possible way.
But aside from that, guys, just enjoy the war, I guess.
Have a laugh.
Yeah,
exactly.
Enjoy
Bring back
being
some
blown up and
souvenirs,
shot at. That's
a German's tooth,
But no being friendly.
Honest to God. Oh Lord.
I mean, I'd like to say
Anyway,
I'm surprised,
World War
but
One.
I'm not.
Yeah, it's not exactly a massive revelation at all.
Sadly.
So, in the following couple of decades, there was a series of paramount chiefs, all descended from Mashweshwe, so this is kind of hereditary. Letsi II was an ineffective paramount chief.
I'm sorry, when you said that, I thought you were introing into, let's see, the second chief, who was, sorry, okay, their name is Letsi, I get it now, I'm good.
So he wasn't great. He didn't have any real interest in government, for instance, which is a problem. His successor, Paramount Chief Griffith Leratholi, Well, firstly, that's a weird name.
It is a
So I think
bit,
this is
yeah.
when they became Christian. I think he named himself after a missionary.
I was going to say, Griffith. Saint Griffith? But yeah, if there's some white man wandering around,
that's
he
the
might
best
have,
I could do for that. It's definitely not a
lobbed onto
traditional African name. He saw a struggle between the paramountcy, which he controlled, and various groups to define the country's future. He sought to revitalise the chieftainship by re-establishing control over lots of minor chiefs, and he was a forceful proponent of conversion to Catholicism, which was his religion, as a way of modernising and kind of Europeanising the country. He also opposed all efforts at reforming the system of chieftainship initiated by the Basutoland Progressive Association and the Commoners League. So he's like, neither forward nor backwards, but to Rome.
I don't like either of you guys.
church words. Yeah.
He died in 1940, so he had a good innings, and he was succeeded by Simon Sesotho Griffith,
What? Sorry?
Simon says
so.
maybe.
Simon says.
Simon say so. If you say so. Let's see. I say so. Griffith.
I'm gathering
That was
that
his full legal name.
your surname is your father's name, at least for paramount chiefs. So you get a kind of a shuffling of names each generation.
So the next chief is going to be named Chief Simon Says So. Is that right?
Simon didn't say so. No chief.
But don't worry about Simon. He dies after serving for 1 year as paramount chief. And there was a brief regency by a fellow I'm not going to go into. But then his first wife, called Maseru, became regent for her stepson, the future king.
Yes.
So she was his first wife and therefore his primary wife. She had a daughter called Nsebo, which is why she's Maseru.
Okay.
And her ward, the stepson she was ruling for, was by his second wife, and he was called Bereng.
Okay.
She was elected by the various chiefs to be the regent, and recognised by the British Resident Commissioner as such.
Hello.
And she had to be approved by the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Moyne, who I clicked on the blue link when I came across him in a Wikipedia article. He was of the Guinness family.
Was he?
A Dublin-born lord of the Guinness family, who were an important beer-making business family in Ireland.
They are the Guinnesses.
And he was assassinated by radical Zionists.
What the what?
Yeah.
Where?
Where?
I'm not sure where he was assassinated, but there was a radical Zionist group called Lehi who wanted to collaborate with the Nazis to establish a Jewish state in Palestine.
Oh my God! Oh my
and they
Lord
hated
in
the
heaven.
British a lot because they wouldn't give them all of Israel.
I mean, guys, we all hate the British. We can all get on board with that. But have a biscuit, take a walk. Don't collaborate with the Nazis.
Yeah,
Good Lord.
It was a bit like, I think they were writing to Hitler, kind of going, you know how you want all the Jews gone from Europe? We've got an idea. And he's like, that's not what he meant, guys. That's not what he meant.
I gotta say, this is awkward, because there's this whole thing in the UK in the British Labour Party where one of the former senior members, who was formerly Mayor of London, kept going on about this.
Oh, yes. Ken Livingstone? Is that right?
Yeah, Ken Livingstone, exactly. And he's essentially been run out of the party. He did have a bit of an obsession with this point. And everyone was a bit like, we'd really love it if you stopped talking about this, because it's it's a very awkward point, and it requires a lot of nuance, and I don't know if you're approaching this with the due nuance and consideration. You just keep saying, Hitler really loved Palestine. Like, no, not quite. Doesn't really give the full colour of what happened. It's not the same.
Anyway, Manseba, she had rivals for power within Lesotho, as is always the case with regencies, because the child king can be easily swayed one way or the other. Her main rival was Bereng Griffith, who was her brother-in-law, so the dead chief's brother.
But her son-in-law was also Bereng, correct? Okay.
You make it sound like it's confusing.
Not for me, but maybe for the listeners, who knows?
It might be easier if we...
If you're listening to this and you're halfway distracted, it's possible. And try to keep it all straight. Yeah.
Everyone's called Bereng. Just Assume they're all called Bahrain.
Yeah. It might be easier if we call the future king by his future king name, Mashweshwe II.
Aha.
So let's call him that from now
That's
on.
a good marketing move, I would say.
Mashweshwe 2, also Mashweshwe.
Mashweshwe, Return of the Mashweshwe.
Her rivalry with her brother-in-law Bareng is fascinating. They had just founded a new Supreme Court in the country, and he took her to the court to oppose a rule arguing both that a woman couldn't act as a chief under traditional law,
Wow.
and as a corollary, or as a follow-up, that as his brother's widow, she should marry him.
Oh my god.
Because apparently that was a thing.
Ooh.
I think that's a thing in the Bible. I think he was using
But
that as a...
this was in, what, the 40s? 1940s? Yeah. Maybe not so much anymore.
For those of you familiar with the TV show Deadwood, that was like a central part of the storyline, that the main guy, the sheriff, like married his brother's widow to take care of them. It's just like seen as taking care of your family.
If it's being nice, that's fine. If
in
it's
this
to
case,
expropriate her property, it's a little different. If it's like we are shepherds wandering the hillside, and my brother's wife and children are now destitute because he's dead, I'll add them to my harem. That's different to, you have a country I'd like, you have to marry me.
Yeah.
Joe, how's your harem doing? I've been
sure.
meaning to ask you. How's the harem coming along?
All good, yeah.
Sweet, good to check up on these things.
So the judge dismissed his case, but he continued, and this is great, he continued to agitate until 1949, when he and the former regent, who I didn't talk about in any detail, they were both convicted of, have you ever heard of a thing called muti?
No.
No, please go on.
Oh. So, how do I put this?
Oh, he's hesitating. I'm very excited.
Imagine you want to do some traditional African witchcraft.
Okay.
I always do. Go on.
And you need some like human corpses to do it with. So muti is the term. Muti murder is the term for when you kill people to use their bodies for like witchcraft. It's a thing.
It seems like a missed opportunity to call that mutilation.
Yeah, so I definitely heard of this as
that is fantastic. I'm sorry, that is nuts
as a thing, but yeah, I did definitely have to look it up. Anyway, they were convicted of that and hanged, so that's how I'm out of the picture.
All right,
tough luck, jerks.
Which is a pretty good way to go. Like, if you're kind of like, which side am I on? Oh, the one that doesn't kill people for witchcraft. Cool, easy.
Queen Maseru is also. She figures in during the World War II period. So, big ups to I believe it was Gary O'Daly,
super listener,
one of our super listeners. The 80 Days podcastettes. I don't know. We don't have a collective term for fans of the podcast. We'll work on that. But so he pointed out to us this interesting article about there being a replica Spitfire gifted to modern day Lesotho as a result of what they did during World War II. And that's a little bit confusing, because why would they have lots of fighter jets in South Africa? It doesn't really make any sense. But the reason behind that is that during the war, the people of Basutoland donated super generously to this fund. And as a result of this fund, they bought 25 Spitfires, which flew as the number 72 Basutoland Squadron. And the planes had Sesotho names like Makese, Mashweshwe, Tababoiso. The last was actually a name that was also given to a plane in World War I. 3 Sopwith Camels were named after Sesotho names in World War I as well. The fund was begun in 1939 by J.T. Bassiane Thorne, and he gave a personal donation of £500 and was also then given an OBE for his valuable part he played to the public life of Basutoland. The original goal was £50,000. But in the end, they collected 120,000,
wow,
which is mental when you consider, what that actually meant at the time of the country. And they were given a full-size replica Spitfire jet as a commemoration of their generosity and their help in fighting the Germans.
They were also, as with World War One, they were recruiting people for the war effort. And I found this amazing paper by Mary Nombulelo Netebene around the recruitment of Basutoland people during the war. So the first campaign of recruitment concentrated on junior chiefs, the police force, government employees, the kinds of people who will, are probably already working for the government and are kind of into this. And they sent them off to the training depot in South Africa in 1940. Resounding send-off, music, farewell speeches, yay, words of praise, pride, encouragement from their fellow Basotho. Big, happy times. A quote from Queen Maseru: "We are prepared to obey any call, which we may be called upon to answer for the prosecution of the war, and we are ready for any sacrifice, which we may be asked to make to help His Majesty's government to achieve victory." Queen Maseru, badass.
Nice.
The narrative behind why people were actually quite keen to join was that some wanted to kind of pursue the warrior's life, some wanted just kind of the economic rewards. There wasn't really an enormous amount of economic activity in Basutoland, so this was seen as a way to, go out, see the world, get paid to do it. As the recruitment drives prolonged, however, they were taking in more and more reluctant people.
Oh.
So one resistor informant testified that he attended his principal chief's call to arms, Pitso. Pitso just means meeting.
Yeah.
He's gone along to the community hall meeting. There was a long wait, which, as they later realised, was quite deliberate, because when hunger and thirst set in, they were offered plenty of free joala, which is a traditional beer. This was doctored with hard liquor. This plan worked because it was quickly led to simulated trampling of Hitler and his kind. They got a lot of recruits from this drive. Another, and I telegraphed this at the start of the episode, many informants testified that prospective recruits used cayenne pepper, snuff, and other irritants to induce eye irritations. Some men poured condensed milk into their ears to look like pus, or as a secretion around the genitals.
Yeah.
Self-inflicted injuries were also common, including the extraction of healthy teeth. Some men faked lunacy or mental disability by wearing their pants backwards and dressing as old women. Anyway, I just really enjoyed that. It was a super paper. It's really, I would advise you to seek it out and read it.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes,
Absolutely.
I suppose. So, Manseba had vanquished her male rival, but she still had disputes with another woman, namely Mabereng, her co-wife? Is that the word? So the mother of the future king. And the big problem here was about how he should be educated. Mansebo obviously thought he should be educated Catholically, and Mabereng thought he should be a Protestant. And that's never happened before. But anyway, she was a shrewd leader. She laid the foundations of the constitutional monarchy, which would follow upon independence. She consulted with the National Council where appropriate, allowed freedom of association, which meant lots of political parties were able to form in the 50s. Such as the nationalistic Basotho Congress Party. And she would later be associated with the splinter group from that, the Basotho National Party. They both wanted self-determination and independence from Britain. In 1957, the BCP had a split. And a group called Marema Tiu Party merged. And I just loved their reason for existing, which was a fear that commoners would take over everything.
Wow.
So they were kind of a chief party. the Basotho National Party, which I think we'll talk about a bit later, led by Chief Lebua Jonathan.
Yes.
That was kind of made up of lesser chiefs and Catholics who disliked the Pan-African view of the BCP. So they were more nationalistic. Manseba was the only female ruler before independence, and Mandela describes meeting her in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
Deadly.
He remembers meeting her, and she chided him for his poor grasp of Sesotho, which he said made him realise his parochialism. So she was giving Nelson Mandela a talking to. It was like,
nice.
You've got very poor Sesotho, Mr. Mandela. You should be ashamed of yourself. In 1960, she was forced into retirement by... she'd been on the throne now for 20 years, and she had developed enemies, and she died 4 years later. This led to Constantine Bereng Sesotho.
Another Sesotho.
Which was the full name of the now no longer young man. So he would have been, 20, 21 at this stage.
Is Maseru too?
And he became he became Mashweshwe too.
Yeah, Mashweshwe too.
And he oversaw the transition to independence, a new constitution, 1959. Basuto Congress Party wins the vast majority of the National Council in 1960. But half of the seats were appointed by chiefs and conservatives, so they actually didn't get to do any ruling, despite winning the vote. And yeah, in 1965, there's universal adult suffrage elections. The Basuto National Party take 31 seats out of 65, and BCP slightly less. And in 1966, under this kind of leadership, the Kingdom of Lesotho attains full independence, a bicameral parliament, and like a constitutional monarchy where the king limited his powers.
Things are pretty well set up at that point. Like they got ducks in a row. You know, got two big parties, got some like head of state person, elections.
They got a Mashweshwe on the throne.
They have their own Mashweshwe.
No need for violent uprising to get independence.
Yeah.
It was just kind of going that way. So everything's set up for a nice peaceful run to the modern day.
Yeah, I think it's all downhill from
I'm
here.
just going to say, let's skip to modern day, guys. I do not see oh wait, sorry. There's like 10 pages. Okay. So
I actually have a screenshot here. I don't know if you're in the notes, Mark, but I have a screenshot here of from Wikipedia. Coups, self-coups, and attempted coups in Africa since 1960. Lesotho is in there 5 times.
Oh my lord!
So I did a quick calculation.
Oh my god, that's nuts!
In 44 years, there were 5 coups, which averages out to a coup every 8.8 years. So if you're a coup fan, you're really going to enjoy the next part of the podcast. And if not, maybe you can just skip to the modern day.
Yeah.
Do you think we should just take a quick break here, and then we'll get our coup on? All right, Mark, let's get going with these coups.
Yeah, so it's 1966. The official request for independence was given then, and they were granted it in October. I have found this note that people were kind of a bit unhappy about how the independence was given. It was given freely, basically. It was like, do you want some independence? Yes, please. Grand. It was like the easiest independence ever. But it was overshadowed, apparently, by Botswana's declaration of independence. Botswana got in just before them, and they felt a bit like, we should have done it a few weeks earlier, because now no one cares, because Botswana's now independent.
They stole our thunder, kind of thing.
That was the kind of thing, yeah.
Wow.
And still more people were unhappy about the flag that was chosen for the newly independent kingdom, because it was the same flag in terms of colours as the Basotho National Party. So some people felt that was a bit like, they're kind of like making themselves the country, which is not good.
Well, it was very common in Africa during this period that just the party that was in charge would just design a flag in their colours.
So what was the flag, Mark?
The colours were green, white and blue, I believe. And it had a symbol of Lesotho, the Mokorotlo, a ceremonial hat inspired, some say, by Mount Kiloane, which is a very cool mountain. I would recommend you Google it. This is not the medium for telling you about this mountain and the shape of it. It looks like a fancy hat.
Shaped like the hat.
Yeah, shaped like a fancy hat. But as I say, fancy hats are not all we have to talk about, because this is Africa, baby. Okay, so I'm going to give you like a little bit of independence as to why, little bit of background as to why independence was the thing. So Lesotho and Botswana and many other countries were being given independence because the British Empire was going kaput. They'd kind of lost their swagger and all of their money, really, as a result of World War II. And then they had
The UN was pushing for decolonization as a worldwide activity.
Why don't you give these countries their countries back?
And the UN being essentially America. That was kind of an American thing. They were quite keen on that. And they had the Suez Crisis as well, which didn't go very well, and the Americans wouldn't help them. And then France was kind of really trying to hold on to Algeria, and that was a super bummer because it was like a really grisly war, and everyone hated it. And the British were looking at that and saying, we don't want to do that at all. No thanks. So independence for all our friends, kind of.
And of course, Ireland had been causing trouble. That was mostly settled by now, but we were the first domino.
They had had a taste of it, and they didn't really. They could see how it was going to go. Anyway, so the BNP won their elections in '65, and then when 1970 rolled around, Lesotho got their first taste of proper independent elections. It suggested that maybe they should kick out the BNP. Maybe get rid of these guys, this government crowd, not so keen. Maybe replace them with the other guys who aren't the government.
Yeah. What do they think they're doing designing our flag?
So the ruling BNP, in a classic move, cited some election irregularities. 3 million undocumented immigrants, let's say, something like that. Irregularities such as their opponents getting lots and lots of votes.
That is highly irregular.
So I want to play a little African nation.
Bingo.
Bingo. African nation, 20th century bingo.
Right.
Just fill in the blanks. Okay.
Right.
Luke first. We got two, so one for Luke, one for Joe. So the BNP suspended the blank. Luke?
Constitution.
Constitution, yes. Joe? One more? What are they going to suspend?
Civil liberties?
Ooh, good guess, good guess. I mean, assume there are no civil liberties. It's Parliament. No more Parliament, no more Constitution. Thank you.
They're just suspended, though.
Just suspended. Suspended. Like, pants. Suspended it like some pants. BNP decided to just bloody well go on ruling. In 1973, Lebu Jonathan, who was head of the BNP, and you've already mentioned him, Joe, he established an interim national congress in kind of recognition that he really didn't have any authority to rule at this point. So the interim national congress was basically him for the next 13 years. A slight pause, just because I did spend so much time listening to this bloody thing. It was actually really bloody dreary. This is a peek behind the curtain. It's not always fun researching countries, but I listened to this kind of dreary fella. I think you listened to him as well, Joe.
This was the
John Arne Flesner.
The anti-politics machine.
So something like that. It was just that...
It was like development as a tool of Western something or other.
Yeah, they wanted to do it bottom up as opposed to top down. And the view was that made for a less resentful and less aggressive population. Then again, we were about to hit a bunch of coups, so I think that's kind of stupid and garbage. But I did spend a lot of time listening to it, so I'm going to say it on the podcast.
Yeah, like it was sort of... There were interesting topics covered. It just wasn't a very engaging...
Anyway.
Again, we'll put a link in the show notes.
Lucky you guys, you're listening to this podcast, not that old dreary garbage. Ugh.
To be fair, though, at least the person being interviewed was a an expert specifically in development in Lesotho, as opposed to us.
Listen, come at me, John Arne Flesner.
I'm sure he has a rabid fan club on Twitter. I'm sure they'll be after you, Mark.
Oh, they'll be on me on the Reddit, on his subreddit later on. Don't worry. So there was domestic unrest over what the BNP had done, but we also have to consider what was happening around Lesotho. We have mentioned before, geographically, it is completely surrounded by South Africa, and South Africa itself has hit more than their fair of rough patches in the past 50 years. That's I'm basically referring to apartheid as a rough patch, but I'm a subtle guy, so that's what it is.
Right.
So, yeah. Some context. Most of you will have heard of the ANC, the African National Congress. That's Nelson Mandela's party, and they still run South Africa to this day.
Somewhat less efficiently than they did under him.
True enough. But they had a kooky, shooty, left-wing spin-off group called the PAC, the Pan-African Congress. And the PAC were not so keen on the landmark Freedom Charter that the ANC had put together. And that was in 1955, and it had 10 pillars, which were essentially their kind of stone tablets of rights that they wanted to bring in for everybody. I will say that I read through the charter, and the 10 pillars, and every single one ends with an exclamation point. So it's like
Just like the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill.
freedom to practice religion. It's really cool. Anyway, so the PAC sided with Jonathan's opposition, Leabu Jonathan's opposition, the highly, very genuinely elected BCP. So then they cozied up to the ANC. BNP linked with the ANC in kind of opposition to the BCP PAC. I feel like I'm John Arne Flesnering the audience at this point. Sorry for that, guys. So basically, Lesotho's government, official government, was kind of getting pushed towards the ANC in a weird way, which made them not very popular with the South African white government, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
South Africa became very pissed off with Lesotho. The PAC helped found a terrorist group inside Lesotho called the Lesotho Liberation Army.
Classic African coup name.
Who were then trained by 80 Days all-star Muammar Gaddafi.
Oh, wow.
He is the Ajax of terrorism. I have in my notes. He just trains everybody and sends them out into the world. So, this new terrorist group that has been founded to just wreak havoc in Lesotho started blowing up bits of it. They blew up a main post office, the Hilton Hotel, etc., etc., lots of various different things. Just for reference, we're now in kind of 1979, 1980 when they start blowing stuff up. Okay. I think it's not really like, they're not a big organization, they're just blowing stuff up for maximum kind of publicity. So hence the big landmark buildings. What kind of group of maniacs would target a post office? Honest to God. Anyway, it's an Irish independence joke, guys. Anyway, so this pushed Lesotho further down the path to chaos, especially as South Africa was now funding the LLA. South Africa was basically giving them money to blow bits up of Lesotho because Lesotho were friends with the ANC, and the ANC weren't friends with South Africa at that time. So it's really it's a bummer in terms of how linked up it is. But this put them against Die Groot Krokodil.
That sounds Dutch.
Did you guys feel like you were in Johannesburg for a second there? So Die Groot Krokodil is the big crocodile.
I never would have figured that one out.
So Peter William Botha is the big crocodile. A very scary dude.
So is he a superhero or what's?
He was the head of the military during this time, and he was the reason that South Africa was funding this terrorist group. He would eventually become prime minister of South Africa.
Oh.
And he was also the originator of South Africa's nuclear weapons program. That I always just love pointing that out because no one really knows that South Africa was a nuclear power briefly. They had like 3 or 4 nuclear weapons. They are the only country in the world to successfully dismantle their own nuclear arsenal.
Oh.
But he was the reason. He was the guy. He's like, nukes, yes, we have them now. Oh God, no! You shouldn't have nukes, South Africa. No one should, but you especially. Anyway, so this Botha guy, the big crocodile, he was not going to put up with the ANC having a safe space inside South Africa. So he recruited a man called Justin Lekanya, the head of the Lesotho army at the time, to take out the trash. Here we have our first coup. It's been a long time coming. Justin Lekanya, he was a commander of the army, and he overthrew the Prime Minister, Leabu Jonathan, in 1986 in a military coup, following apparently a revelation that Justin himself was the victim of a hoax by 2 guys from the PAC. Basically, he was kind of funding a revolution against himself, basically. He was paying them to fight him, and he only realized it after the fact that the people he was paying to fight the revolution were actually fighting him. And it was very embarrassing. So anyway.
He doesn't like to talk about that anymore.
The hoax had resulted in Lekanya financing the Lesotho Liberation Army against himself. So Lekanya comes in. He immediately sought to improve relations with South Africa. Oh, that's surprising. Look at that there. He's making friends. Good lad. So anyway, this support for the ANC is no longer there. No longer happy about that. Lekanya also gave more powers to Lesotho's king. He kind of empowered the king, and then he came into a dispute with the king, and then he deposed the king in another military coup. Boom, 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 in 1990. See you later, King Boy.
Bye, Mishweshwe.
Bye, Mishweshwe 2.
So that's 2 now.
We're on for 2.
2 down.
So another thing he did was to buddy up with South Africa was to sign a deal to sell them lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Lesotho's water. This agreement is still in place and has given us the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. So there's a great podcast about this in Planet Money, super podcast. If you're interested, it's episode 706. But I remember when we decided to do Lesotho, I was like, there's something I know about Lesotho, some mad bloody thing, and this was it.
Yeah, it's water. Yeah,
it was originally conceived of by the British in the 50s, and it's arguably like a big wet wall-shaped argument for its independence. They were like, look, we can make it independent, then we can control the water, and then great. Because it's a big kind of water-absorbing bit of land because it's up so high and has huge rainfall. And, their question was, how can Lesotho exist on its own? It's far too small, has no resources. It has all this water, though. So there's many stages of this project to be built, but what's there at the moment gives Lesotho about $4 to $5 million per month in just cash. And that's for 34.6 meters cubed per second of water shooting up to Joburg.
Wow.
They basically are the reason Joburg has water.
They're basically Johannesburg's mains water supply, is what you're saying.
Pretty much. They're a huge contributor to it. And as you probably know, Cape Town has had massive issues with this. Joburg, not so much, only really because of Lesotho. And as a result, Lesotho has had drought issues because they're giving all their water to Johannesburg. And the amount of water
they can't afford not to.
And they can't really vary it either. It has to be that same amount of water going out all the whole time.
Right.
They don't really have control over it. They're locked into this agreement. Tough luck. But they do get a lot of money from this. So it is a huge contributor to the economy.
It's kind of a continuation of what was happening with the early settlers, kind of saying, we want this river for our cows.
Yeah.
But that's our river. It's like, yeah, but it's ours now.
Yeah. Anyway.
Water is a big resource in Africa.
And increasingly so. That's probably one to watch for Lesotho for the future. But South Africa built all the infrastructure around it, and there is some hydroelectricity coming off of it, so it's not all terrible. But anyway, so skipping ahead, we're 2 coups in. In 1991, an uprising against the general's rule began on the 29th of April. Military units went on strike demanding better wages. The strike eventually turned into a when it became clear the general had no intention of addressing the demands. Soldiers supporting the labor action then surrounded his residence, and he was forced to resign. This is a quote from Justin Lacagna. "It seems to me that the nation has been complaining for some time over my leadership and the performance of some of my colleagues." Thrown a bit of shade there, Lacagna. "I therefore announce my resignation and that of my colleagues." He's gone. 1993, new constitution implemented, leaving the king, who is now Letsi III, who replaced
the third,
Maseru II.
Oh, of course. So the Maseru isn't dead, but he is in exile.
Yeah, they get rid of him.
And he won't come back under the conditions being offered, so his son is forced to be king.
Let's say 3. So
Let's see.
This guy comes back and he has no authority, as you say. Maseru looked at the deal and was like, no, thank you. So the BCP finally ascends to power. They've been knocking around for ages, finally in power. They get a landslide victory. The Prime Minister, Nitsu Mokele, he heads the new BCP government. And they gained every seat in the 65-member National Assembly. That is mad. In early 1994, political instability increased as first the army, followed by the police, and then the prison services engaged in mutinies.
Okay.
In August 1994, King Letsi III, in collaboration with some members of the military, staged a coup, suspended parliament, and appointed a ruling council.
This is what's called a self-coup, isn't it? When someone who is the head of state has a coup to make them more head of statey than they were already.
Yeah.
He was in power. Yeah, he's like cooing by the percentages, I guess.
So Letsi has led this uprising to give himself
more power.
The powers he thinks he deserves.
And he's supported by the military. And as a result, troops fired on thousands of protesters marching on the royal palace. 4 people were killed and 10 wounded in the clashes in Maseru. As a result of the domestic and international pressures coming from this violence, the constitutionally elected government was restored in a month. A month, gentlemen. So that is me up to. I believe I said it was going to go to 94. So that's me there. If somebody wants to take over this coup baton and bring it on home.
In January 1995, Maseru II was formally reinstated as King of Lesotho.
I'm back, baby!
Maseru is back, but...
I mean, a year later, his car plunged off the side of a mountain.
I'm dead, baby!
Totally non-suspicious circumstances.
The early hours of my 7th birthday.
Right.
Joe, where were you? This is for your own good, Joe. Just get your story straight, okay?
I think I was drinking Fanta.
Drinking heavily.
And eating crisps.
In Lesotho.
Yeah, so
anyway.
Like, he dies a year after taking power. Me and Mark kind of discussed this before. It sounds super suspicious.
It's super suspicious.
He's been in exile for years, and no one seems to think.
Nobody cares.
No one raised it up.
Just driving around 1 a.m., car goes off a cliff. Yeah, no, the king's dead now, it's fine.
I will say a couple of things, and this is guessing a little bit, but do we think everyone is really, the roads are in really good shape in Lesotho? Probably not. Do we think all the cars are in good quality and running very well? Probably not. Do we think there's a lot of qualifications for driving and stuff? Probably not. So, there probably is higher incidences of car crashes and stuff compared to some countries, but all the same, this was the king, and he just did a coup. So, anyway.
It just seems suspicious to me, but no one else seems to think so we'll move on.
You tinfoil hat wearing crazy man.
In 1998, May 1998, parliamentary elections in Lesotho resulted in an overwhelming majority for the ruling the Congress for Democracy Party.
Sounds good.
Which won 79 out of 80 seats. But Jesus. That sounds like almost too overwhelming of a majority.
You bite your tongue.
Allegations of fraud soon rose to the surface after that, and there was a failed lawsuit by the opposition parties to, investigate the circumstances of how the Congress for Democracy Party won so many seats. That lawsuit didn't go ahead. Then rioting broke out in Maseru, and this resulted in what was called Operation Boleus, which was led by Nelson Mandela in South Africa, where Mandela, because as we've already talked about, South Africa at the time was very much reliant on Lesotho for water, and Mandela wanted to protect that. So he deployed 700 South African troops to Lesotho on 22nd of September 1998 to quell the rioting and maintain order. It's a bit of an awkward situation. I don't think that he was necessarily internationally sanctioned to do so, but
Oh no, he wasn't.
He went ahead. Yeah.
I do love Nelson Mandela was like a really complicated guy, and like you see people kind of trying to hold him up as the paragon of this and that, and in many ways he is. Like, he did amazing stuff and was a remarkable person.
He deserves full marks for not
doing the mad stuff that he could have done,
flipping apartheid on its head and doing it back.
But like he was a really complicated guy, and I really enjoy the kind of I don't know, the squirm I feel when trying to reconcile Mandela the peacemaker and also the invader of this country with 700 of his troops, and just to quell some rioting, which was probably totally justified. I think interesting guy. We can never really do South Africa. Far too complicated.
Oh no, never. The operation was described by South Africa as a quote-unquote intervention to restore democracy and the rule of law. And I found an interesting New York Times article on this that I'm going to read a little bit from, which I think best sums up the situation. This is from a writer called Suzanne Daly, and this was in the New York Times in 1998. We'll leave a link to it in the show notes. He says, probably the biggest blunder South Africa made in invading the tiny kingdom of Lesotho on Tuesday was a military one, sending fewer than half the soldiers it ultimately needed. But it's hard to say, the list of blunders is so long. At week's end, a measure of calm had been returned to Lesotho's capital, Maseru, and the fighting in nearby hills appeared to be over. But it was clear what South Africa had planned as a quick and easy military operation to end political turmoil in Lesotho had gone terribly wrong. More than 60 people were dead. Downtown Maseru had been turned into rubble by looting and burning, and anger against South Africa was so strong that white foreigners could no longer walk safely in the streets. Looting had apparently spread to the more remote regions of the country, Refugees were streaming outwards, and there were reports of food shortages. Nor was there progress in resolving the political struggles that had led to the invasion in the first place, raising the spectre of South Africa as a long-term occupying force. The size of the blunder was being assessed all over South Africa as opposition parties questioned whether President Nelson Mandela's government needed or even had the legal right to invade Lesotho. They thought they were being preemptive, says James Higgs, research director at the South Africa-based Institute of International Affairs, moving in before they had a big refugee problem, an exodus that South Africa would have to deal with. But what happened was almost the reverse of what they intended to do. They destroyed the trading community. They now have long-term problems, and it's going to be very expensive for South Africa to repair.
Great.
So, yeah, that's a kind of neat little summary of that coup.
Oh boy.
The questions that were raised after this intervention never quite, went away. It is still somewhat of a controversial part of Lesotho's history and South Africa's history as well. There was an article written by International Peacekeeping, which is an academic journal in 2007, that said that South Africa's intervention was totally inconsistent with the UN Charter and with the SADC treaty, which was in place at this time. The goal for South Africa was to secure, like I said, natural resources, mainly water, but it kind of backfired completely, and didn't look good for South Africa at the time at all, and led to, again, more instability in Lesotho from this point forward. The last coup that we're going to talk about was in 2014, bringing us right up to near enough the modern day.
Oh my word.
Oh, it's quite recent.
Yeah. In June 2014, Prime Minister Thomas Thabane suspended the parliament for fears of a coup d'etat, allowing him to avoid a vote of no confidence, which was coming up in the next couple of days.
That's not a coup, you dumb motherfucker.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
He was given permission to do so by the king, and the opposition parties were not super happy about this.
Weird.
Deputy Prime Minister, a guy called Metsing, had been agitating for some time against the Prime Minister, and he'd assured his supporters that he would form a government if Thabane was removed from office.
That's not very loyal.
He seems like the kind of guy that was like really very much angling for power. I think I read something about like they had very differing kind of views, and had been, in the years previous to this, they had been both vying for the leadership.
Right.
Thabane had sort of came out on top in that struggle, but this guy Metsing was like, I think I can still sneak in there if I can get this guy out of power. South Africa issued a statement rather than sending in soldiers this time, saying that the government, quote unquote, notes with concern the unfolding political and security situation in the Kingdom of Lesotho, which has resulted in the prorogation of the country's parliament. The South African government has further noted with grave concern the unusual movements of the Lesotho Defence Force units in the capital.
So they were all doing a moonwalk, I suppose, were they? Unusual movements.
Yeah. South Africa will not tolerate any unconstitutional change of government in the region and continent. So they used their words this time. The South African Development Council also condemned the Prime Minister's moves to suspend the parliament. In August of 2014, Thabane attempted to appoint this guy Mahao as the commander of the military, and he was attempting to replace a guy, Kennedy Tlali Kamoli, I think is how you pronounce his name.
It's an interesting name.
He is a really, really, really not a nice guy.
Okay.
I'll expand a little bit on him later. But the military was a little bit split on the Prime Minister attempting to replace this guy. Some people were loyalists to Kamoli. So Thabane, fearing a coup and fearing like the military rising up against him, he fled Lesotho for South Africa. Just hours before the military surrounded his residence, attacked police headquarters, killed one police officer and injured many others. He then held emergency talks with Jacob Zuma, the South African president at this time, and mediators around the region. Thabane publicly came out and told the world's media that his country's army was staging a coup against him. The army denied it, saying that they had acted against the police, who were attempting to give arms to political agitators and essentially try to arm people who would be rebelling against the army. I have a clip here of Thabane talking to Al Jazeera at this time. He looks pretty miffed, to put it lightly, about the fact that his military is staging a coup against him.
Prime Minister Thomas Thabane left Lesotho for South Africa on Friday. He joins me now live. Prime Minister, are you still Prime Minister?
Yes, I still am.
because you said earlier there'd been a coup.
I still am Prime Minister of Lesotho.
And has the military acted together with your deputy prime minister while you were out of the country?
There has been talk about that, but I seriously do not want to say I would say yes to that or no to it. Because I don't see what benefit would come out of that if indeed he did. But I hope that that is really not the case. I have not engaged with him on the matter because it was not necessary to do so. Instead, I have engaged directly with the situation itself and looked at the situation straight in the face. Now, whether or not indeed he would be involved, I am not going to say so. But if he was, and indeed if the rumor that he is would be true, that would be very unfortunate, because our formation government of my party, his party, and the third party is the first for our country. And it has been hailed as the whole democratic world as one example in Africa that many other countries would be asked to follow. And I personally would wish that the three of us leading the three parties in the coalition would seriously take ourselves as that which we are, a very good example for Southern Africa and a very good example for Africa as a whole.
So the next day, Deputy Prime Minister Metsing gets his wish, and he slides right into office, and he's at the head of the government. Tabane returned to Lesotho later that week, but was protected by police and South African and Namibian forces around the clock.
Oh, wow.
The Deputy Prime Minister Metsing's Congress for Democracy, that was his the LCD, Lesotho Congress for Democracy, they were blamed for the coup, along with the guy that I mentioned earlier, General Kamoli. In the midst of all this chaos, raided the government armories in preparation for a showdown, and warned his allies of a quote-unquote bloodbath if he were forcibly removed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So South Africa's Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa then took responsibility from Jacob Zuma and was like, "I'm going to sort this out. I'm gonna figure out what's going on here."
It's probably a wise move.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you know anything about Jacob Zuma,
Zuma's not the most temperate guy.
So the elections that had been scheduled for, I think, 2017 were brought forward to February 2015. And the parliament then reconvened in October of 2014.
Okay.
So that was sort of the end of the political strife. There's a sort of a bleak kind of side note here, whereas in June 2015, after the elections had taken place and things had sort of calmed down a little bit, Mahao, who's the guy that was supposed to take over the military, was confronted by army forces while driving with his two nephews, and although his two nephews escaped unharmed, he was shot 11 times in the head, chest, and arms with automatic weapons.
Whoa.
That's quite decisive.
The Ministry for Defense at the time claimed that he had been killed in a special operation to round up suspected military mutineers following a quote-unquote confrontation with the soldiers.
Oh boy.
So, yeah. And the UN came out and condemned this guy's murder. And a report was like an investigation into his death was conducted in early 2016. But the government, I think, kind of fearing further repercussions from this and, possibly another coup, who knows, they suppressed the report, claiming that interviewing witnesses outside the borders of Lesotho was a breach of legal procedure. And it did recommend the removal of this guy Kamoli as head of the army, and he was later forced into early retirement. But it's sort of, from what I read, widely accepted that he was the one who orchestrated this attack. Again,
right.
Nothing's been proven or is conclusive. So also in 2016, just to rub salt into wounds, an amnesty bill was introduced in the National Assembly, which granted impunity for all crimes committed by security forces between 2007 and 2015, which would cover this murder of this would-be army general.
I think that situation's a clear-cut one for, like, sarcastically saying how convenient.
It's very convenient, yeah. The people in charge would argue that that's to sort of try to sweep everything under the carpet and, sort of just move on. But obviously it is extremely convenient for the people that orchestrated this guy's murder. So
bit of a result there.
Yep. All right, we'll take a very brief break and then we'll move on to modern day. How's that sound?
Okay, so when we decided to do Lesotho, I decided I was going to have a chat with a fellow by the name of Sean Lyons. Now, Sean is the father of one of my very good friends, Colin, and he actually spent quite a bit of time out in Lesotho in the not too distant past. He was out there working with an Irish NGO called Action Lesotho. So I wanted to have a chat with him about his impressions from his time there. Very pleased to talk to you today, Sean. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mark. Always great to hear from you.
What was your first impression, outside of the projects that you were working on, what was the major impression it left in you?
Because I'd worked in Africa previously, the first thing that struck me was the landscape. Beautiful country, I must say, because of the altitude. A lot of the landscape of Lesotho is quite lunar. One of the things, and I hate generalizing about Africa, but when you arrive at an airport in Africa and you're going into the city, you're struck by the number of people walking. There's just hundreds of people walking, carrying their bundles and so on, and the small little shops, selling the bits and pieces on the side of the road. The people incredibly friendly, very, very friendly. So a fascinating country. But within my first couple of hours of actually, getting into it and interviewing people and going to meetings and so on, I found the dependence on foreign aid was just very, very noticeable. It's still something like 22% of government spending is dependent on foreign aid, which is huge.
Yeah.
I met some amazing people who are these American guys. AMF, the Aviation Missionary Fellowship, and they were pilots. They were all Texans and Missouri, and they used to say, we don't preach the word of God, but we fly those who do. They work in various parts of the world, and they fly to the remotest regions. I was supposed to actually go up in the plane with them one day, but unfortunately it didn't work out. One of them was telling me that there was a village that they were flying ministers to preach, and they went one weekend around Easter, and they had a movie, the Jesus movie, I think he called it, and it was a big deal, it was a big social event to show a movie, but they had to cancel it because there were somewhere in the region of 15 funerals in the village that week, in a village of less than 1,000 people. And the headman of the village was only 14 because all of his family had died and he was the one left. And when you think of that absolute devastation, I know it keeps coming back to the AIDS pandemic.
Number 2 in the world in terms of prevalence of HIV.
It's significant. And I've been very fortunate, Mark. I've travelled an awful lot, and I've worked on virtually every continent like yourself. But I thought, that it was difficult to impress me and to shock me. But I went into one of the projects that was being run by the Durham group, and I sat in on a sexual safety class that was being run for some high school girls. And for the first time in my life, and the only time in my life, I saw a female condom.
Sure.
But the reason these girls this was being demonstrated and why they were being given these was that when they were on the bus on the way home from school at the end of term, they would wear these condoms in case of rape.
Oh, jeez. Right.
And I was just really gobsmacked.
Yeah.
And another issue I saw there which impacted on me was that fundamental Christianity and Islam are vying for the soul of Lesotho. I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
God.
Like, I was told by the aviation guys that the Islamic missionaries, if you like, are recruiting the brightest and best young boys from the villages, bringing them to Saudi and places, and making imams out of them in their own image, and they're going back to Lesotho now, preaching that message. The Christians, on the other hand, the American revivalists, I was going to a small newspaper one day, the only independent newspaper in Lesotho at the time, and there were posters up along the side of the street for a big gospel revival meeting. Some American Christian, Robert J. Coleman Swazniak, the 15th, you know. And it was, come to our meeting, we can cure AIDS, cancer.
Oh
so
my
on.
God.
And I went into the newspaper office, and I was chatting to the editor, and he showed me the headline of their last paper, which is where they were exposing witchcraft, where some of the smaller villages, they were, animist people believing in witchcraft. And he said they wanted to expose this. And I pointed out the window and I said, well, you've plenty of material out there as well. I pointed out one of the posters. And the staff were shocked. They said, oh, no. The people in the village, it's the power of the devil. These men have the power of Jesus. So Awkward, yeah.
Oh, good Lord.
And I wasn't invited back.
Yeah.
All right. So modern day Lesotho. Mark, do you have anything on this?
Yes, sure. Their literacy is actually quite high. It's 80% above Egypt and Liberia and Bhutan. Some 80 days all-stars there. We maybe have mentioned this before, but it is the cool fact about Lesotho is that it is the only independent state that is entirely above 1,000 meters in elevation.
They like being high.
Yeah.
The highest point is 3.5 kilometers straight up.
Also, a large portion of the population of Lesotho works in the mining sector in South Africa today.
Yeah,
that's a huge source of employment for people in Lesotho. So they kind of commute backwards and forwards in and out of South Africa, or occasionally they do live there in South Africa and they work in the mines. And migrant remittances, a lot of which come from people who work in the mines, are extremely important to the local economy, as well as, like we mentioned earlier, the selling of the water is also makes up a large part of the economy. And in 2018, Lesotho becomes the first African country to legalize cannabis cultivation, which I thought was kind of interesting.
As I say, they like being high.
On the mining, even though they're not a very large producer of diamonds, the area is a big diamond production area. Lesotho is interesting because it produces very large diamonds on a weirdly consistent basis. So it's high in the mountains. It's 3,100 meters where they do the mining, and they yield 10.8 carat diamonds and larger, many of them, characterized by very high color and quality. And they produce several diamonds larger than 100 carats, which is enormous. That is like paperweight diamonds.
Wow.
So they also have the highest price per carat production in the world. They also produce some pretty low-grade crap as well. On the economy side, so you mentioned the weed. They also are known as the jeans capital of Africa.
Of course.
At its peak in 2008, their exports of clothing totaled $340 million. And last year, the industry of garment manufacturing accounted for 20% of GDP. They have this agreement with the US, which is a big part of the reason for this, is the African Growth Opportunity Act, which gave Lesotho textile and clothing products duty-free, quota-free access to the American market. So big producers actually have based in Lesotho to take advantage of this tax loophole. 26 million pairs of denims per year are produced. And the sector has turned into a prominent source of employment, and it created about 40,000 jobs in Lesotho.
Joe, did you want to mention anything about Sesotho, the language?
Just that the Sesotho language is spoken by most Basotho people, about 2 million people, and more fascinatingly, about 4 million people in South Africa. So there's more Sesotho speakers in South Africa than in Lesotho. It's 8% of the population. And I pulled out some phrases here that I thought were nice. For instance, have a good day is letsatse lemonade, which sounds like a nice drink to me.
It does.
And the way you say hello, we mentioned it up the top in describing the flag, is
Hotzo,
which is peace.
All right,
Cool.
That's pretty cool.
So it's there's a few variants of language here in South Africa, but it's still very much alive and kicking, unlike a lot of indigenous languages. And I suppose it has the advantage of being the country kind of coalesced as a nation state, as opposed to a group of tribes. And maybe on culture, it's worth mentioning the Basuto blankets.
Okay.
Which are iconic. So if anyone's seen Black Panther, a recent blockbuster success, the people who guard the borders of the fictional mountain country of Wakanda, their kind of blankets that they wear, the kind of woolen blankets, are directly modelled on Basuto.
Cool.
A fictional African mountain country? Is there possibly a bit of inspiration there?
I think there is, yeah.
Definitely. They took inspiration from a lot of places, but this particular... and basically the designs will match the rite of passage, so you might get a new blanket when you get married with a marriage sign, or upon initiation rituals for adulthood, you might get one with a relevant design to that. But interestingly, they were only introduced in 1860 by, I think, a Scottish guy called Mr. Howell, met Mashweshwe.
Oh God! I was going to say some white bastard.
Well, no, he just kind of said, "Hey, here's wool," and Mashweshwe kind of went, "Yeah, we're running low on leopards, so this is good."
Okay.
Because of droughts and things, they were actually a bit low on animal skins, and so they became kind of a big part of the culture from then on.
Cool.
And then the hats, as you mentioned, as well.
Mokorotlo.
They also have one of the only skiing resorts in southern Africa,
Of course.
and the skiing resort is called Afri-Ski, which I thought was pretty cool name. It's located 3,050 meters above sea level, and is about a 4.5-hour drive from Johannesburg. Just one of only two ski resorts in South Africa.
It must be one of the only ski resorts in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, and it offers a 1 kilometer ski slope, a beginner slope, and operates during the winter months as well. Of June to August. So if you want to go skiing in Africa, Afri-Ski is one to consider.
Sport, they are pretty good at football, considering that they are quite small. They have a 20% win record and have a dominant win ratio against Mauritius, the Comoros, Sudan, Burundi, and Laos. They are just ahead of Liberia in the FIFA rankings at the moment. Another 80 days past topic. They did have a story recently at the Commonwealth Games in 2018. They've won no Olympic medals or anything like that. But it does suggest that they're not particularly a sporting powerhouse. This is more like, yay, we're in it together kind of story, rather than Lesotho is really good at sports kind of story. So Lineo Chaka, representing the country of Lesotho, ran the last 3 laps of the women's 10,000 meters on her own at the Carrara Stadium. 3 Australian athletes stayed on the track waiting for her to finish, which was kind of the story, showing, camaraderie and stuff. She did run 10K in 37 minutes, which is amazing, and kicked my ass all day long. But she was also 3 minutes slower than the next slowest, which was why she was on her own on the track out there. So nice, but not necessarily really amazing athletics.
So amazing for a normal human, but not remarkable for an elite athlete.
That's kind of where I'm going with this. Food, I did find a thing called pap, which is basically polenta. That's a big thing there, and they like beer and tea. Rooibos tea, especially, which I'm a big fan of myself.
Oh yes, it's good tea.
It's very good tea.
All right, that'll do it for Lesotho, I think. Very interesting place. A lot of coups, a lot of mashweshwes.
Very cool.
A lot of mashweshwes, a lot of coups.
Okay, if you want to find out any more about Lesotho, if that wasn't enough for you, you can find more links to videos and related articles and some of our reading and that sort of thing in the show notes, which will be available in your podcast player, or are also available on the 80dayspodcast.com website. We would really, really love it if you could review the show on Apple Podcasts. That really helps our visibility, helps us to climb the rankings. Even just a star review. Take a couple of minutes out of your day to do that. That would be great. If you've made it this far in the episode, then chances are you probably have a couple of minutes to go leave us a rating.
Luke's negging you, listeners. He's negging you.
Yeah. And you can find more episodes of the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We mentioned a bunch of episodes that we've previously covered and locations we've previously covered, so you can find those in our back catalogue.
Yep. On our website, we have a map, an interactive map you can find all of our episodes on.
Sure.
So if you go to 80dayspodcast.com/episode map, you'll find all of the countries we've done displayed in a nicely geographic way.
We are also on Patreon now. If you want to, throw a few shekels our way, you can find us at patreon.com/80 days podcast. That helps us to defray the cost of putting the podcast on and hosting and, all that sort of stuff. So we'd really appreciate if you could support us there. You can also get in touch with us by searching 80 Days Podcast on pretty much any social media platform. Or you can email us directly at 80dayspodcast@gmail.com.
Also, a thank you to Sean Lyons for the interview he gave. Very generous of time. Thanks for that.
Joe, do you want to tell people where they can find more about you on the internet?
You can find more about me on timetoburn.com.
And I'm on Twitter at MarkBoyle86.
You can find more about me on my website, lukejkelly.com, or at the Luke J. Kelly on Twitter. As always, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Salah Huntley.
Also, goodbye.